The phone rang 4 times before her mother answered. It was a Sunday evening in July 1967, 3 weeks after Monterey, and Janis Joplin was calling from a pay phone in San Francisco because the apartment she was staying in did not have a telephone, and she had been meaning to call for 3 weeks and kept not calling, and finally tonight, with the coins in her pocket and the phone booth on the corner of the block and the fog beginning its evening approach from the bay, and no particular reason to put it off any longer. She had dialed the Port Arthur number she had known since childhood. The number had not changed since she was 7 years old. This was one of the reliable facts of her life, that whatever else changed, and a great deal had changed, the Port Arthur number was the same. She had called it from Austin and from San Francisco and from venues in cities she was passing through on the way to somewhere else. She had called it at all hours and in all conditions, and the voice that answered was always, eventually, the same voice. Dorothy Joplin answered on the fourth ring, slightly breathless, the way she always answered, as if she had been somewhere else in the house, and the phone had required her to come to it rather than being already beside it. Her voice was the voice of a woman who organized her days carefully and had strong opinions about the correct way to do most things, and loved her children in the particular way of mothers who express love through concern rather than declaration. "Janis," Dorothy said, "I was wondering when you'd call. Not reproach, just fact, the kind of sentence that contained a history." They talked for 45 minutes. This was longer than their usual calls, which tended toward the informational "how are you, where are you eating properly?" The practical inventory of a parent tracking a child who had moved far away and into a life that the parent could not entirely picture. But this call was longer because the world had changed in the 3 weeks since Monterey, and Dorothy Joplin read newspapers and had been told things by neighbors and had seen something on the television and had questions that were more than the usual practical inventory. She asked about the festival. She asked about the performance. She asked about the reviews, some of which she had read and some of which her neighbors had told her about. She asked whether it was true that 60,000 people had been there. Janis answered all of it. She was good on the phone with her mother, better than she was in person, where the accumulated history of their relationship and the specific physical presence of Port Arthur could make the air between them complicated. On the phone there was just the voice, and she could manage the voice, could give her mother the version of the story that was accurate and also manageable, the version that did not include everything. She did not include the way she had felt walking off stage after the performance, the particular quality of that specific exhaustion, which was different from ordinary exhaustion and required a language she had not yet developed to describe. She did not include the thing she had noticed in the 3 weeks since Monterey, which was that the world had become a different size, not larger exactly, more present, more demanding of her presence within it. More certain that she owed it something and more confident about its right to collect. She talked about the good things because there were good things, because Monterey had been genuinely extraordinary and she knew it and was not going to pretend otherwise to a woman who would see through the pretending immediately. And then there was a pause in the conversation. Not an awkward pause. They had known each other long enough for pauses to be part of the conversation rather than interruptions of it. A pause in which Dorothy was doing something, or thinking something, or organizing what she wanted to say next. And then Dorothy asked the question, "But are you happy, Janis?" 5 words, her mother's voice, steady and direct, coming through the telephone line from Port Arthur, Texas, from the house where she had grown up and the life she had left and the woman who had watched her leave without being able to stop her. Janis did not answer immediately. Pause that followed was long enough that Dorothy said her name again, Janis, not as a question, just as a presence, just to indicate that she was still there, that the question was still there, that neither of them was going anywhere until the thing was addressed. And Janis said, "I don't know, Mom," which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone since Monterey, and possibly for longer than that. Dorothy Joplin had not wanted her daughter to go. This is not a simple statement about a simple woman. Dorothy was not simple. She was organized and capable and had read more books than most of her neighbors in Port Arthur and held opinions about the world that were more nuanced than her circumstances might have suggested. She had understood, earlier than most people in Janis's life, that her daughter was not an ordinary child, the excess of failing. The voice that was too large for church, the paintings that covered her bedroom walls, the blues records that seemed to feed something in her that regular food could not, Dorothy had seen all of this and understood it as clearly as someone can understand a thing that frightens them. What she had wanted was for Janis to find a way to be what she was without the cost being so high. This was not an unreasonable wish. It was, in fact, an extremely loving wish, the specific wish of a parent who looks at a child with an extraordinary capacity and understands that extraordinary capacities extract extraordinary prices, and who would prefer that the price be negotiated down to something the child can afford to pay without destroying other things in the process. The price, as Dorothy had watched it accumulate over the years since Janis left Port Arthur at 19, had not been negotiating down, it had been going the other direction. The first San Francisco chapter, the return to Texas, the attempt at a normal life, the second departure, the years of small venues and borrowed floors, and the particular grinding uncertainty of a life organized around something that might not pay off. Dorothy had followed all of it from Port Arthur, through the phone calls that were informational and the occasional visit that was complicated, and the general knowledge that her daughter was somewhere far away doing something that made sense to Janis and did not entirely make sense to Dorothy, though she tried. And then Monterey. Dorothy had seen the television coverage. She had read the review in the newspaper, not the music press, which Port Arthur in 1967 did not carry, but the general press, which had found enough in the Monterey performance to merit a story. She had read the words the journalists used: incandescent, volcanic, shattering, words that were not the words she would have chosen for her daughter, but that she recognized as attempts to describe something real. She had felt, reading those words, something complicated, pride that was genuine and enormous. And underneath it, running alongside it, something that the pride did not cancel, a worry that had been with her since Janis was 14, and singing too loudly in the church choir. And it was clear that the largeness of what was coming out of her was not going to be accommodated by Port Arthur or by any of the arrangements Port Arthur had available. The worry had a specific shape, which was this: that the thing Janis had, the voice, the capacity, the enormous interior reservoir from which the performances drew, was not separable from everything else in her, that you could not have the voice without having all of it, that the same depth that produced the music also produced everything the music was not. She had been worried about this since 1957. Monterey had not resolved the worry, it had enlarged it. And so, on a Sunday evening in July, when her daughter called from a pay phone in San Francisco, Dorothy Joplin listened to 45 minutes of accurate and manageable information about the festival and the performance and the reviews and the 60,000 people, and then she asked the question that was underneath all of it. The "I don't know, Mom" that came back through the telephone line was not what Dorothy had expected. She had expected, based on the preceding 45 minutes, something more along the lines of what Janis usually gave her, the affirmative, the reassurance, the version of things that was positive enough to be believed and vague enough to be not quite a lie. Janis was good at that. She had been good at it since she was old enough to understand that her mother's worry was real and that certain kinds of honesty increased it without helping anything. But the "I don't know" came out before the management could catch it. It came out the way things come out when you have been holding them for 3 weeks, and the right question, asked in the right voice by the right person, opens a door that was more lightly latched than you realized. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does that mean?" And Janis, holding the phone in the booth on the San Francisco corner, with the evening fog beginning to come in off the bay and the street going about its business around her and the coins running down in the slot, tried to find a way to say the thing that she had not said to anyone. She said it was real. The performance was real. What happened up there was the most real thing I've ever done. Dorothy waited. Janis said, "I just don't know what it means after, when it's done. What I'm supposed to do with how it feels when it's done." There was a pause on the Dorothy end of the line. A pause in which Janis could hear the Port Arthur kitchen, the particular background silence of a house she had grown up in, the refrigerator's hum, the quality of the air in a room she could picture exactly without being in it. Dorothy said, "That sounds lonely," not as a conclusion, not as a diagnosis, as a recognition, the recognition of a mother who had been watching her daughter from a distance for years and had understood something about the shape of it that she had not previously found the words for either. Janis said, "Yeah, and then the coins ran out and the call ended. The way pay phone calls ended in 1967, abruptly, mid-conversation, the technology making the decision that the people on either end of the line had not made themselves. She stood in the phone booth for a moment after the line went dead. The fog was coming in properly now, the way San Francisco fog came in, not gradually but decisively, changing the quality of the air and the light with a speed that always surprised people who hadn't lived there long enough to expect it. The street looked different than it had 20 minutes earlier, cooler, softer at the edges. She had just told her mother something she had not told anyone else. Not Albert Grossman, her manager, who was practical and forward-looking, and organized the world into problems and solutions, not the members of Big Brother, Peter Albin, Dave Getz, Sam Andrew, James Gurley, who were her bandmates and in certain ways her family, but who were also inside the thing with her and therefore not positioned to see it from the outside. Not the journalists who had been calling since Monterey, wanting the story of how it felt, wanting the version of Janis Joplin that confirmed what they had already decided she was. She had told her mother. And her mother had named it correctly on the first try. That sounds lonely. The thing about Dorothy Joplin was that she had been watching Janis for 24 years. She had been watching from a position of proximity and distance simultaneously, close enough to see the details, far enough from the music and the career to see the shape of the whole. And the shape of the whole from Port Arthur looked like a woman who had found the thing she was made for and was also, in the finding, further from ordinary human warmth than she had ever been. Janis knew this. She had known it in one form or another since the first time she performed and understood that performance was the place where she was most herself, and also, by definition, most separated from the people she was being most herself in front of. The paradox was not new. But hearing her mother name it so plainly, from 4 states away, on a Sunday evening in July, made it more legible than it had been before. She left the phone booth. She walked back toward the apartment. The fog had come in completely by the time she got back, and the city was doing the thing it did in the fog, becoming smaller, more intimate. The large distances collapsed into the immediate block and the immediate corner and the immediate door in front of her. The Monterey performance had given the world something it did not know it needed until it had it. That was the standard account, and it was accurate as far as it went. The reviews had said it. The people who were there said it. The trajectory of her career after that afternoon said it in the most concrete possible terms. The record deals, the venues, the profile that grew and grew until it had reached a size that required its own maintenance, that had its own gravity, that pulled things toward it without Janis having to do anything except continue to exist within it. What the standard account did not say, what no review or profile or career trajectory could capture, was what the performance had cost the person giving it. Not in the romantic sense of artistic sacrifice, not as a complaint, as a simple fact about what happened when someone opened themselves that completely to that many people and then walked off stage into the ordinary world and had to locate herself within it again. Dorothy had named it lonely, the specific loneliness of someone who has just given an enormous thing to an enormous number of people and has, in the giving, been further from connection rather than closer to it. The loneliness of the distance between the stage and the wings, between the performance and the life that continued on the other side of it, between the Janis Joplin that 60,000 people had just experienced, and the Janis who stood in a phone booth on a Sunday evening and said, "I don't know," to the person who asked if she was happy. She kept performing. She kept giving. She kept going back to the stage and opening herself completely and giving it everything she had, because this was the only answer she had ever known how to give, and because the music required it, and because somewhere in the giving, despite the cost, there was something that felt more like truth than anything else available to her. But she remembered the phone call. She remembered the way her mother's voice had sounded when she said that sounds lonely, not as an accusation, not as a failure, simply as a recognition delivered with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who has loved someone for a long time and has learned to say true things without embellishment. She remembered the fog coming in, the coins running out, the line going dead mid-conversation in the way of pay phones, the abruptness of it, the decision made by the technology rather than by either of the people who still had things to say. She would call again, of course. She would call from other cities. Other phone booths, other moments when the coins were in her pocket and there was no reason to put it off. The calls would go the way they went, informational, manageable, the practical inventory of a parent and a child separated by geography and by the particular difficulty of being too much alike to be comfortable and too different to be easy. But the Sunday evening call would stay with her, not as a wound. As a coordinate, a fixed point from which she could take her bearings when the other coordinates shifted, which they did constantly, which was the nature of the life she was living. She had said "I don't know" to her mother, and her mother had said "that sounds lonely," and both of those things were true, and the trueness of them was, in its own way, a form of connection that the performance could not provide. Dorothy Joplin had asked one question, Janis had not been able to answer it, and in the not answering, something had been said that was more honest than any answer would have been. The fog stayed in all night, the city went about its business. And somewhere in Port Arthur, Texas, Dorothy Joplin hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen for a moment in the particular silence that follows a call that has said something real. And then she went back to whatever she had been doing before the phone rang, because that was what you did, because life continued regardless, because the loving of someone who was far away and moving fast required you to hold the worry and keep going simultaneously. She was good at that. She always had been.